Want to improve your success with direct sowing seeds this year? Then this video is for you. Let's go. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. One of my favorite methods of starting seeds in the spring is direct sowing out in the garden. I have lots of tips for improving your germination and success with direct sowing, and I'm going to put all of those tips together in this comprehensive guide video. We're going to talk about why you would want to direct sow, the best seeds to direct sow, when to sow them, tips for soil prep, tips for how to sow them, and some hacks to speed up germination and deal with some troubleshooting issues. So why would you want to direct sow? First of all, it's simple to do. You virtually skip all of the steps of starting seeds indoors, hardening them off, and transplanting them out in the garden. You also get stronger plants. Plants grown directly in the ground tend to have stronger root systems, which can result in stronger and more productive plants, especially when the plants don't like their roots disturbed at transplanting. It's also cost effective. You save on pots, potting soil, and grow lights required for starting seeds indoors. And one of the best parts about direct sowing is how well adapted the seeds are to your climate and conditions, because from the day that they germinate, they're exposed to the full wind, to the sun, and the specific soil conditions of their permanent home. So they spend their time growing without the shock of the change of environment or soil. Next, let's talk about seeds you should focus on direct sowing. Certain seeds really appreciate being directly sown into the garden soil. The seeds on the list that I'm about to give you thrive when direct sown. For cool-loving vegetables, there are carrots, beets, spinach, lettuce, radishes, kale, kohlrabi, Swiss chard, and rutabaga, and turnips. For warm-loving vegetables, there are bush beans, pole beans, cowpeas or black-eyed peas, squash, including zucchini and scallop squash, cucumber, okra, roselle, corn, watermelon, muskmelon, and cantaloupe, and gourds such as loofah or birdhouse gourd, and there's also cucamelon. There are some herbs that do very well direct sown as well, and those are dill, cilantro, parsley, and basil. Some cool flowers that generally do well direct sown are stock, bells of Ireland, larkspur, and bachelor buttons. And some warm-loving flowers that love to be direct sown are sunflowers, of course, zinnias, cosmos, and marigolds. Now, that's not to say that you can't start many of these seeds early indoors and then transplant them out. They just happen to do very well being direct sown. So how do you know when the time is right to direct sow? The timing depends on what you are sowing and your specific climate. Soil temperature is a really key component of direct sowing successfully. Many seeds need a specific soil temperature to germinate properly. For example, if you are sowing peas and lettuce, they're going to germinate well in cooler soil that's around 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, while beans and cucumbers really need warmer soil, more like 60 degrees up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. You can pick up a soil thermometer for about $7 or $8 online, and you can use it to test to see if the soil's warm enough for whatever seeds you're planting. Currently out here in the high tunnel, looks like it's almost 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the soil, so it's a great time to direct sow. It's also important to know your estimated last frost date and to plan accordingly. Some of the cool season vegetables like spinach, lettuce, peas can be sown before your last frost date, and the warm season crops like beans and squash and cucumbers should really be sown after your estimated last frost date. Many warm-loving seeds will germinate a lot better for you if your soil is at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. Beans and cucurbits like squash, cucumbers, pumpkins, watermelons, and gourds will delay germinating until the soil truly starts to warm up in the spring. And corn specifically is one that likes the soil to be at least 65 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate. When you're preparing soil for direct sowing, there are a few tips that are going to help you to be more successful. First, when direct sowing, you really want to start with a clean slate. You'll want to clear out weeds, rocks, and debris so that you have a nice clean soil bed. You can use a hoe or a tiller to help loosen and remove any grass that's there. Another way to create a clean seed bed is to mow any grass or weeds down very low to the ground. And if you have 3 or 4 weeks, you can use a plastic tarp to kill off the grass and weeds that are on the soil surface. And then lay an undyed paper, like a brown craft paper or cardboard, on top of the grass and weeds. Then you pile material on top of the cardboard or paper. I like to use clean topsoil that's blended with compost for this purpose. Just straight compost will sometimes not hold enough moisture to get good germination on your seeds. Next, it's good to have loose, fluffy soil for seed sowing. If your soil is compacted or not draining due to being hydrophobic, you can rake the top inch or 2 of soil to loosen it and then incorporate some organic matter like a compost or a peat moss or cocoa coir or even some worm castings. You just want to see the water move down into the soil when you water it. You want to see it drain. You don't want the water to just sit on top of the soil. Some seeds will actually thrive in poor soils that are sandy or clay, but typically you'll want to amend poor compacted soils with some compost for added nutrients. Or if you can prep the bed months in advance, you can use a cover crop to build soil health, and that's even better. Lastly, for seed starting, you want a level bed. If it's sloped or lumpy, you're going to have uneven watering, and that can really result in spotty germination. Next, let's talk about how to actually sow the seeds. The directions on seed packets are a really good place to start, but they're not always the ideal. When it comes to the directions on seed packets, I pay close attention to the recommended spacing between plants. I tend to sow at least 50% more seed than the total number of plants I'd like to end up with due to possible loss because of insects or spotty germination. This might mean sprinkling a little extra seed into the trough if I'm sowing carrots, or if seeds are larger and plant spacing is further apart, I might sow 2 seeds every 12 inches for something like cucumbers, or 3 seeds in a cluster every 3 feet for pumpkins instead of just 1 seed. And then later I'll thin to 1 plant if I feel like it. Row spacing I find to be more of a suggestion to make access and harvest easier if you're growing on a larger scale or in rows. I find it to be largely irrelevant for raised beds and smaller spaces. With plant spacing, it gets easier year after year in growing and figuring out what works for you, but I tend to overcrowd my plants rather than undersow because space is at a premium for me. A general rule of thumb for seed depth is that you sow it 2 to 3 times deeper than the seed is wide. So you look for the seed diameter, and twice that is usually deep enough to sow the seeds. This is because the seed only has so much energy pent up inside of it to push through the soil to the surface. And if the seed is tiny, the seedling with its little cotyledons, the little seed leaves, is also very tiny. And if it's planted too deep, it can struggle to break the surface. Seeds like lettuce or carrots can barely be covered with soil. I like to scratch the surface of the soil, sprinkle the seeds, and then press them into the surface, creating a sort of Velcro that will hold on to the seeds and as I water and wait for germination. Larger seeds like beans and squash need to be planted a little bit deeper, usually 1 inch is good, so that they have contact with soil on all sides of the seed and they can absorb and retain the moisture that they need to germinate. To speed up germination, you can soak larger seeds like beans and peas overnight before sowing. Any larger seed with a hard outer coating I have found really benefits from this soaking. Also, it's not totally necessary, but I've found that orienting seeds when sowing can actually speed up their emergence from the soil. To do this, you look for the point at which the seed was connected to the plant. This is also called the seed scar. For cucumbers, squash, zinnias, or sunflower seeds, that's going to be the pointed end of the seed. Or for beans, it's the eye or the spot on the side of the bean. But if you sow them with the point down or the seed scar down, it'll orient them in the correct direction for the radicle or the initial root to emerge pointing straight down into the soil, and that orients the cotyledons, those first leaves, upward toward the sunlight. This just saves the seeds some time and energy trying to turn the seedling around and push it toward the surface. It's not necessary, but it can speed things up a little bit. After sowing, you'll want to gently water the area to settle the seeds into place, making sure to be careful not to wash the seeds away. I like the shower setting for this on my hose. It's usually pretty gentle. And you want to keep the soil consistently moist until you see the seeds germinate. But you also don't want the seeds sitting in a pool of water because they can rot after they emerge. Now, really quick, if you're finding value in this content, I would love it if you would consider liking, subscribing, or sharing it, as that truly does go a long way to help us help more people find joy in growing. A few more tips to help you be successful. You can mulch the area. So applying a thin layer of mulch like straw or shredded leaves can help retain moisture in the soil, regulate the soil temperature, and also help suppress weeds. Just be sure not to cover the seeds too deeply, as they do need light to germinate. I'll oftentimes use mulch as soon as the seedlings get a little bit bigger, just so that I don't smother out the seedlings. I also oftentimes just mulch with aged compost. So I'll mulch with an inch or two of aged compost so that when I sow seeds, I'll brush the compost aside, sow the seed, and then reapply the compost as soon as the seedling has emerged. Also, you want to thin your seedlings. Once your seeds have germinated and the seedlings have developed, it's generally recommended to thin them out according to the recommended spacing on the seed packet. This will give each plant enough room to grow without having them compete for resources. You also want to monitor the moisture level. You're going to want to regularly check the moisture level in the soil, especially in the early stages. Dry soil can lead to poor germination, while overwatering can cause seeds to rot. Here in North Texas in springtime, I find that watering once per day is enough when I'm trying to sprout seeds. Unless it's a very warm and windy day, then I might water 2 or 3 times. Something else to consider is providing support for taller plants. If you're growing something like a snap pea or a pole bean, consider adding support structures like stakes or trellises to keep them upright as they grow. Also, if you're direct sowing, you want to keep an eye out for pests. Those tender little seeds and seedlings can attract pests like birds, insects, and rodents that might dig up or nibble on your seeds or your brand new little baby seedlings. You can use row cover or netting over the seeds or seedlings to protect your plants until they become more established. And finally, let's talk about some issues that you might have and how to troubleshoot them. Poor germination. This can occur if the soil is too cold or too dry. You want to make sure that your seeds are planted at the correct depth with the soil temperature that's appropriate, and you want to make sure that the area is kept consistently moist until they germinate. If you're not getting germination on something, I would recommend making sure that they have moisture consistently. Maybe give it a week, and then if they haven't germinated, I would try again once soil temperatures warm up a little bit more. You also might have competition in your garden beds that's brought on by weeds. Weeds can quickly take over your soil space, and their roots can compete with your plants. Weed seeds often germinate at the same time as the seeds that you've sown, so it's really important to be able to identify the seedling of a plant that you want versus a seedling of a plant that you don't want. Something you can try is a reverse image search on the web, and that will help you identify a plant before you pull it to make sure that you're getting rid of the right ones. And pulling weeds by hand or using a loop hoe between rows can help disturb weed roots before they really take hold. Also, if you see that your seedlings are disappearing, you might have insects eating your seedlings. Tender little baby plants are very attractive to insects like pill bugs. I've found that if I sprinkle a little bit of diatomaceous earth around and on top of the seedlings, it'll keep pests from eating them. You just have to reapply it after you water or after it rains. Or again, you can cover with a little bit of netting with some garden staples or a little bit of tulle, and that can help keep insects off of them as well. Also, I just want to encourage you, I love to take risks in gardening or for the sake of having food or flowers, especially having them earlier than what's expected. So sometimes I will direct sow seeds a little bit early. Sometimes here in North Texas, the weather will warm up at the end of winter and we'll be lucky enough not to have a frost the last few weeks leading up to our estimated last frost date. Some years, direct sowing early can really pay off for me. Other years, it doesn't. But I love to spare a few seeds and see if I can get a jump start on growing some plants. So if you're feeling brave, I would encourage you to direct sow a few seeds a little early too. You can even make a cold frame for the soil by using a clear shower curtain or a clear tarp and draping it over the area. And that will encourage early germination and help to warm up the soil a little bit more quickly. Direct sowing is a very low risk method for seed starting because it's literally just the cost of seeds. So sometimes I just like to go for it. And the last piece of advice I have is don't be afraid of not doing everything perfectly. You're not going to have to do every little thing right in order to be successful direct sowing. And gardening is really just one big adventure. It's a lot of fun to learn and to do, so just get out there and sow some seeds. I hope you'll give it a try. I wish you joy, and I'll see you next time.
Were you snoozing?